Your hands don't work the way they used to, and today, of all days, that is going to get someone killed. Picture a village so small you could walk its length before a kettle comes to boil, sitting in a fold of England where the fields run grey-green under a sky the colour of dishwater. Add smoke that never quite clears the low roofs. Add mud that swallows a boot to the ankle and doesn't give it back easily. Add silence where there used to be noise because 4 winters ago something came through this valley that took 1 person in every 3. And it did not ask how old they were before it took them. That's 1350. Not glorious, not grand. A place where a woman can outlive her own children and then be expected to keep living anyway, because someone still has to remember which field flooded last year and which one didn't. We're going back there tonight, not to watch a king or a knight. We're going to live inside the body of someone the village has almost stopped seeing, a woman old enough that people forget she can still hear them. On the one day her failing hands and her still sharp memory decide whether the village eats this winter or starves. One day, one person, everything she would have felt, feared and fought through. So let's be honest about what this is and what it isn't, because I make these history stories and I've stopped pretending they're only about the grand glittering centuries. Half of you write to me about castles and courts. The other half, and I suspect it's the bigger half, though I've no real way to count you, write to me about the ordinary years, the unglamorous ones, the ones where nothing burns down and no king dies, and the only real drama is whether an old woman's stiff hands can still manage to save a family before her own body finally gives out entirely. This is one of those. There is no throne in it. There is a hip that aches, and a hearth that needs feeding, and a whole village's survival balanced, more precariously than any of them would like to admit, on the failing memory of one woman almost everyone else has quietly decided has already given all she has left to give. Subscribe if that sounds like your kind of quiet catastrophe. Get comfortable. Here we go. Your name is Agnes. You're somewhere past 60 years, though nobody, including you, has kept an exact count since the sickness came and burned the parish register along with half the priests who might have written the numbers down. 60 is already an unlikely age to reach in this valley. Most who share your birth year are dead, from fever, from childbirth, from the plague that rolled through 4 years back like weather, from simple bad luck with a falling cart or a kicking ox. You are one of perhaps 6 people left in the village who remember the world before the sickness, and that fact makes you either valuable or worthless depending entirely on who is doing the counting. You remember the world before it the way you remember a country you once lived in and can never return to, not with simple nostalgia, though there is some of that too, but with the particular clarity of someone who watched the whole shape of ordinary life get overturned in a single terrible season, and has spent every year since trying to build something livable out of what remained. Before, there had been more households than land to give them, younger sons with no strips to inherit, forced to hire themselves out or leave for the towns entirely. Before, a woman your age would have expected, reasonably, to be surrounded by children and grandchildren enough that no single day's crisis could possibly fall on her shoulders alone, because there would always be another pair of hands nearby to share the weight. Before is gone. It went in 6 weeks, 4 years back, and what remains is this, a village thin to its bones, its elderly stretched thin across responsibilities that would once have been divided among a dozen willing bodies, its whole fragile continuation resting, on days like today, on however much strength a handful of aging women and one overworked reeve can manage to scrape together before the next crisis arrives to test them again. This morning it is the counting that worries you. You wake before the light, the way you always do now, not because your body wants to rise, but because it can no longer manage the trick of staying comfortably asleep. Your hip has found a new way to ache overnight. A deep grinding protest low on your left side that no position seems to soothe. You lie still in the dark for a moment, listening to your own breath rasp in and out, feeling the cold press down through the thin blanket, through your shift, into skin that has gone thinner and looser than you remember it being. Your fingers, when you flex them under the wool, answer slowly, each knuckle swollen and stiff, the joints of your first two fingers on the right hand curled slightly inward, no matter how hard you try to straighten them. There was a time these hands could spin wool from dawn to dusk without complaint. Now they ache before you've asked anything of them at all. The hut holds 3 of you. Your daughter-in-law Mabel sleeps across the room with her 2 surviving children curled against her like puppies. And even in the dark you can hear the particular rattle in the younger boy's chest that has been there for a week now, worse some nights than others. Her husband, your son, is 2 years dead. Not from the sickness, which took his father and 2 of his sisters, but from a fever that came after a wound on his leg that shouldn't have killed a young man and did anyway. Since then the hut has held 4 adults' worth of hunger and 1.5 adults' worth of income, and everyone in it knows the arithmetic without anyone saying it aloud. You push yourself up slowly, using the wall for leverage because your knees no longer trust themselves to lift you cleanly from a low pallet. Standing takes 3 attempts and a held breath. Somewhere in your spine something shifts and settles with a small private crackle that only you can hear. You stand there a moment in the near dark, swaying slightly, waiting for the dizziness that sometimes comes with rising too fast to pass. It does, eventually. It always does. One day, you think, without any particular drama, it will not. The smell of the hut wraps around you as your body wakes properly. Wood smoke gone stale in old thatch. The sour tang of the rushes on the floor that should have been changed weeks ago. The animal warmth of bodies that have slept close together all night, and underneath it, faint but persistent, the smell of the boy's sickness. Not quite the smell of infection yet, but heading that way. A thin sourness on his breath that you have learned over 60 years to recognize and to fear. You wrap a shawl around your shoulders, the wool gone thin at the elbows from 40 years of wear, and you go to the boy first, because that is what you do. That is what you are for, now that your hands are too slow for most of the work that keeps a household alive. You are not the one who plows anymore. You are not the one who threshes or hauls or carries. What you are in this village is memory. You're the one who knows which root eases a fever and which one only looks like it will. You're the one who remembers that the flood 4 years before the sickness came ruined the low field but spared the high one, and that this year's storms have been shaped the same way. You're useful in the particular, narrow way that old age allows, and every single person in this hut, including you, is aware of exactly how thin that usefulness has become. You kneel beside the boy. Kneeling costs you a sharp jab through both knees that makes you exhale through your teeth and press the back of your crooked fingers to his forehead. Warm. Not burning, not yet, but warm in a way that worries you more than it would if he were 7 years older, because a child his age has less flesh on him to fight a fever with, less reserve to draw on when the sickness decides to settle in and stay. "He's no better," Mabel says from across the room. Her voice carries the particular flatness of someone who has already decided not to hope too hard, because hoping too hard is its own kind of exhausting labour, and she has none to spare. "He is no worse," you say, which is the truest thing you can offer, and also the kindest. You need feverfew, and you know exactly where the last of your dried supply sits, in a cloth bag hung from a roof beam where the mice can't easily reach it. Your hands fumble at the knot longer than they should. The cord has gone stiff with age and damp, and your fingers, and those two curled ones especially, cannot quite pinch and pull the way the task requires. You feel a flush of frustration rise in your chest, sharp and shameful. The same one that comes every single time your body fails at something it used to do without thinking. You breathe through it. You try again, using your teeth this time to help brace the cord, an undignified little trick you've developed over the past year that you would be embarrassed to have anyone see. The knot gives, the bag comes down. Inside, the herb is nearly spent. Enough perhaps for 3 more doses, and you have exactly no way of getting more until the thaw properly sets in and the early growth starts pushing up along the hedgerows, weeks from now at best. You measure out a pinch smaller than you'd like, because the boy is not the only one in this village who might need it before spring, and you have learned, the sickness taught you this brutally 4 years ago, never to spend the last of anything on the first person who asks. The morning proper begins the way it always does now, slow. You were once a woman who could be dressed, fed, and out the door while the sky was still charcoal-coloured. Now every motion has to be paid for in time you don't feel you have. Lacing your own boots takes both hands and a held breath, and a small grunted curse you'd never let the children hear. Your spine complains when you bend for the laces, a long pull of discomfort from the small of your back up between your shoulder blades, and you have to brace one hand against the wall to keep from pitching forward onto your face like some drunk stumbling out of the alehouse. Your shift is the same one you've worn most mornings for the past 3 winters. The linen gone soft and thin and grey from countless washings, patched at the elbow with a scrap of coarser wool that catches slightly against your skin whenever you raise your arm. Pulling your overdress on over it cost you a fresh negotiation with your own shoulders, which have grown stiff overnight in a way that makes lifting your arms above your head feel, some mornings, like hauling a bucket on a rope gone half frozen in its pulley. Possible, but only with a slow, careful, unhurried application of force, never with the quick, unthinking motion you remember from your younger years. You work one arm through the sleeve, wait for the ache to settle, and then work the other, your breath coming shallow through the effort of it, and by the time both sleeves sit properly on your shoulders, you have already spent as much strength on dressing as you once spent on an hour's spinning. Your hands, when you finally hold them up before you in the grey pre-dawn light, are not the hands you remember owning. The skin across the knuckles has gone thin and spotted, stretched tight over joints that have swollen to nearly twice the width they held in your youth, and deep, permanent cracks run across the pads of your fingers and the heels of your palms, cracks that never fully heal now, no matter how much of the precious tallow and herb salve you rub into them each night. Cracks that catch and sting on rough wool, on cold water, on the raw wood of the door latch. You flex your fingers slowly, one at a time, feeling the small grinding resistance in each joint, the particular stiffness that has become simply the permanent texture of mourning for you now. no different in its way than the cold itself, something you do not fight so much as move through, patiently, because fighting it accomplishes nothing except to waste strength you will need for the rest of the day. Breakfast, such as it is, comes in the form of a heel of yesterday's bread, hard enough now that you must soak it briefly in the thin, watered small beer that serves this household as its safest drink, since the well water has gone foul, and the stream water wants boiling first. You tear the softened bread with fingers that fumble more than they should at so simple a task, chewing slowly because your back teeth have grown few enough and worn enough that hurried chewing has started this past year, to bring on an ache along your jaw that lingers half the morning if you let it. The bread tastes of nothing much, a little sour, a little of the beer it's soaked in, but it sits in your stomach as a plain, welcome warmth against the cold, and you're grateful for it in the specific, unglamorous way that only a body accustomed to real scarcity can be grateful for a heel of stale bread and a swallow of weak beer. Outside, the cold hits you the way it always does in the last weeks before the true thaw. Not the killing cold of deep winter, but a wet, seeping cold that finds every gap in your clothing and settles into your joints like it means to stay there permanently. Your breath fogs in front of your face. The mud underfoot has frozen into ridges overnight, hard enough to catch a careless foot and twist an ankle, and you walk slowly, deliberately, testing each footfall before you commit your weight to it. Because a broken ankle at your age in this village is not an injury. It is a sentence. Before anything else, there is wood to be gathered, because the fire in the hut has burned low overnight, and Mabel is already occupied wringing a cloth for the boy's forehead, and the small store of split logs by the door will not last past mid-morning. This is not strictly your labour to do. There was a time when fetching wood belonged to the younger women, to strong backs that could haul an armful without complaint, and you remember doing it yourself twice a day without a second thought. The wood balanced against your hip, your stride long and easy. Now the woodpile sits at the edge of the yard behind a fence gone soft with rot, and getting to it means crossing ground that has frozen into treacherous ridges overnight, uneven and slick where meltwater from yesterday's brief thaw has refrozen into a thin, near-invisible glaze. You go anyway, because there is no one else free to go, and a hut without fire in this cold is its own kind of danger, worse in its way than the danger of the walk. You test the ground with the toe of your boot before each step, feeling for the telltale slickness under a thin dusting of frost, one hand braced against the fence rail, even though the wood there is soft enough that you can feel it flex slightly under your weight, a small, unnerving give that makes you wonder, not for the first time, how much longer that fence will hold anyone's weight at all. Halfway across the yard, your foot finds a patch of ice you didn't test for, hidden under a scatter of dead leaves, and your whole body lurches sideways before you've even registered what's happening. Your hand shoots out, an old woman's hand, slow and stiff, but faster in that one instant than you would have believed it capable of being, and catches the fence rail hard enough that a jolt of pain runs up through your wrist and into your elbow. You stand there for a long moment, breathing hard, your heart slamming against your ribs in a way that has nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the particular, specific terror that lives permanently now at the edge of every physical task you attempt. The terror of the fall that does not end in a bruise. You have seen it happen to others. An old man 3 villages over broke his hip on ice not unlike this 2 winters past, and he was dead before the frost fair season came round again, not from the break itself, but from the long wasting weeks of fever and immobility that followed it. his body simply unable to recover from an injury that would have healed cleanly in a younger man within a season. You do not fall. You stand still until your heart slows, until the ringing fright drains out of your limbs, and then you finish crossing the yard in smaller, more careful steps than before, your pride sitting somewhere far behind your caution in the order of what matters this morning. The woodpile itself presents its own small cruelty. The logs at the top are frozen together in places, fused by a night's freeze and thaw into a solid, unyielding mass that your hands, weak as they are, cannot easily pry apart. You work at it anyway, wedging your fingers into the gaps, feeling the cold bite into skin already thinned and cracked from years of exactly this kind of labour, until a log finally gives way with a sound like a small dry crack of thunder and nearly takes the top of your thumbnail with it. You suck air through your teeth, shake the hand once, hard, and keep going, because the fire still needs feeding regardless of what your thumb thinks about the matter. You manage 4 logs, not the full armful you once would have carried without thinking, but 4, gathered awkwardly against your body with one arm while the other hand steadies you against the fence for the walk back, your breath coming short and fast by the time you reach the door. Not from the cold this time, but from the sheer physical cost of a task that should, by any fair accounting, require nothing more than a few minutes and a healthy back. Mabel looks up as you come through the door, and something in her face flickers. Gratitude, yes, but also unmistakably guilt. The particular guilt of a younger woman watching an older one do labour, that guilt tells her should not be the elder's to do, even as practical necessity insists otherwise. Because Mabel cannot leave the boy's side, and there is genuinely no one else in the hut capable of the errand. "You should have woken me," she says, taking the logs from your arm before you fully set them down. You were tending him. It needed doing. You do not say the rest of it. That carrying 4 logs across a frozen yard has left your arm trembling and your hip screaming in a way that will not fully ease for an hour. That the fear of falling sat in your chest the entire walk and has not entirely left it yet. There is no purpose in saying such things to a woman who already carries more worry than her own shoulders can comfortably bear. You have learned over the years that some burdens are kinder kept to yourself, parcelled out only to the degree that honesty absolutely requires and no further. The village itself is smaller than it was. You can see it in the gaps between houses where families used to live, and now there is only a fallen-in roof and a doorway nobody has bothered to clear, because there is nobody left who wants that particular house, or nobody left who remembers whose it was. 4 winters ago this lane held perhaps 40 households. Now it holds 26, and several of those are single old women like you, or widows with children too young to work, all of you clustered together at the edges of a community that has too much land and too few hands to work it. The strips of open field beyond the village show the same story written across the land itself. Whole furlongs that used to be ploughed and sown every season now lie fallow, or worse, half reverted to rough grass and bramble because there is no household left to claim them and no labour left to spare for clearing them back into use. The Lord's own domain land, worked once by dozens of villain households, owing their customary days of labour, now struggles each spring to find enough hands willing or obliged to plough it, and you have heard, from Osbert and from the steward's own careless talk, that manors up and down this whole stretch of country face the identical problem. Too much land suddenly, absurdly, more land than there are living bodies left to work it. an inversion of the old scarcity that would have seemed impossible to imagine before the sickness came and rewrote every old arithmetic at once. It has changed things in ways that go beyond simple hunger. You've heard whispers, from traders passing through, from Wat's own priest, from anyone with news of villages beyond this valley, that some lords, desperate for hands to work their emptied fields, have begun offering better terms than custom ever allowed before. Lower rents, shorter service, even wages in coin to any labourer willing to leave one manor and work another's land instead. It would have been unthinkable, a decade past, for a common labourer to bargain with a lord over terms. Now in some places it is beginning to happen anyway, because the sickness took so many hands that the ones remaining have for the first time in living memory something like leverage. You do not know if it will last. You suspect the lords will fight hard to put the old order back exactly as it was, once enough time has passed for them to gather their courage and their law clerks both. But for now, in this strange, thinned, uncertain season, the world has shifted slightly on its axis, and even a woman as old and unlearned in such large matters as yourself can feel the shift beneath her feet, the way you can feel a change of weather coming in your aching joints before the sky itself gives any sign of it. Closer to hand, in the lane itself, the fallen-in houses have already begun the slow work of returning to the earth. Thatch that no one repairs sags and blackens and eventually collapses inward, and the timber frames beneath, untended, rot at their joints within a few winters, leaning further with each storm until they finally give way entirely. You remember whose hands built some of those houses. A carpenter named Will, dead of the sickness, who built 3 of the finest cottages this village ever held, cottages that now stand empty and sagging because every soul who once lived in them is buried in the same churchyard you passed this morning. There is something unbearably strange in watching a man's careful, skilled work outlive him by only a handful of years before it too begins to fail, as though even good craftsmanship cannot argue for long against a world so thoroughly emptied of the people meant to inhabit it. You pass the well, where 2 younger women are already hauling water, their backs strong and their motions quick, and you feel the old familiar pang, not envy exactly, but a kind of grief for a body you used to have and will never have again. One of them, a girl named Isabel, who used to run errands for you as a child, catches your eye and nods a greeting, and you nod back, and neither of you says anything about the fact that you used to be able to haul 2 buckets at a time yourself, or that now you would not attempt even one without help. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being seen the way the young see the old, as furniture that talks. You're not unkind to think it, it is simply true. Isabel is not cruel to you. She is simply young, and the young do not yet understand what it costs to lift a bucket when your shoulders have worn down 40 years of joints to bone grinding against bone. You did not understand it either once. You remember, with a clarity that startles you sometimes, watching your own grandmother struggle to rise from a bench and feeling nothing but mild, unexamined impatience. You are ashamed of that memory now in a way you never expected to be. The reeve finds you before you reach the church. He is a heavy-set man named Osbert, younger than your dead son would have been, thrust into his position by the simple, brutal fact that the sickness took the previous reeve along with most of the men who might have replaced him with someone older and more experienced. He runs the village now not because he is wise, but because he is one of the few left standing who can read a tally stick and shout loudly enough to be obeyed, and everyone, including Osbert himself, knows the difference. Agnes. He says your name the way he always does, with a faint edge of impatience, as though every conversation with you is a debt he's already decided he doesn't want to pay. The Lord Steward comes at midday to reckon the manor's grain. He wants the full tally. What's stored, what's owed, what's left after Lady Day rents are paid. You feel the cold settle deeper into your stomach, a different cold than the weather. And Peter, who used to keep the reckoning, is dead these 2 winters, and his son can barely mark his own name, let alone read the old tally sticks and the priest ledger both. Osbert's jaw works, the muscle in his cheek jumping. You kept house accounts for the old lord's bailiff once, before you married, before all this. His hand makes a small, tired gesture that seems to indicate the entire ruined state of the world. You still know the marks? You do still know the marks. It is one of the strange gifts of a long memory. The things learned young and used constantly stay sharp long after the body that learned them has gone soft and slow. You spent 6 years as a girl helping tally grain and rents for the old bailiff before your marriage, learning the notched sticks and the simple letter forms the priests used for numbers. And though your eyes have dimmed and your hands shake now when you try to hold a stylus steady, the knowledge itself sits in your mind exactly where you left it, undisturbed by 40 years of disuse. I know the marks, you say. Then you'll do the reckoning today, before midday. Osbert doesn't ask this as a favour. It isn't framed as one. It is simply what will happen, because you're the only person left in the village capable of doing it, and your usefulness for once outweighs your age in his calculations. The steward's a hard man. If the tally's wrong, if it looks like we're hiding grain, he'll take more than we can spare to make up for what he thinks we've cheated him of. You understand what that means for the winter stores. You understand exactly what that means. You have lived through enough winters to know precisely how thin the margin is between a village that eats until the spring planting and a village that starts burying its old and its young somewhere around Candlemas. The sickness took 1/3 of you 4 years ago. Hunger, mismanaged, could finish what it started. I'll need the tally sticks, you say, and someone with steadier hands than mine to hold the stylus while I speak the sums, because I can tell you what the mark should say, but I can't promise to cut them clean any more. Osbert looks at your hands, really looks for the first time in this conversation, and something crosses his broad face that might be discomfort, or might simply be the recognition of an inconvenience. I'll send you the priest clerk boy. He writes well enough. He walks off without further courtesy, already shouting at someone else about a broken fence, and you stand alone in the frozen lane for a moment, feeling the particular weight of having just been handed the survival of an entire winter by a man who could not quite bring himself to say thank you for it. You make your way toward the small stone church that has survived 400 years of weather, and 4 winters ago buried more of the parish in 6 weeks than it usually buries in 6 years. The graveyard runs alongside the path, and you do not look at it directly, because you know exactly whose names sit under which humps of settling earth, and there is only so much grief a person can carry into a working morning before the work itself becomes impossible. Inside, the stone floor holds a cold that seems to rise up through your boots and settle directly into the bones of your feet. The clerk boy is already waiting, a thin lad of perhaps 12 named Watt, ink-stained fingers and a runny nose, clutching a bundle of notched wooden tally sticks and a scraped sheet of parchment that has clearly been used and reused until the surface has gone thin and fragile in places. He looks nervous. He should be. Neither of you has done this exact work before, not in this configuration, and both of you know that the stakes attached to getting it wrong are not abstract. "Read me the sticks," you tell him, easing yourself down onto the cold stone bench along the wall, your hip protesting the whole way down with a grinding ache that makes you catch your breath. "Start with a tithe barn stock. Notches for the wheat first." He reads them to you slowly, running his finger along each stick and counting the notches aloud, and you close your eyes and let the old system come back to you the way a half-forgotten song comes back once you hear the first few notes. The marks the old bailiff used to keep were not the same everywhere in England. Every manor had its own private shorthand, a language spoken between the reeve, the bailiff, and the Lord Steward, and understood by almost no one else. But the shapes of it, the logic underneath it, comes back to you whole and complete, the way things learned in girlhood so often do, long after things learned in old age have already slipped away. 11 quarters of wheat, you say, once Watt finishes reading the notches. Write that plainly for the steward, then the barley. He writes slowly, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, and you watch his hand form the letters and feel a small, unexpected ache of tenderness for him, for the fact that he is trying so hard at 12 years old to do a dead man's job because there is quite literally no one else left to do it. You remember being that age. You remember what it felt like to be handed responsibility too large for your hands and told, implicitly, that failure was not an option anyone could afford to indulge. The reckoning takes most of the morning. Your body punishes you for the stillness of it. Sitting on cold stone for hours does something cruel to a hip that already aches, and by the time you've worked through the wheat, the barley, the oats, the store of dried peas, and the small precious hoard of salted meat that has to last until the spring slaughter, your lower back has locked into a stiffness that makes standing, when it finally comes, into its own small battle. You get it wrong once, a genuine error, not a failure of memory, but a simple miscount. 4 quarters of oats you'd tallied as belonging to the domain store when in fact they'd been set aside as seed grain for spring sowing. A mistake that would have meant the village going into the spring planting 4 quarters short, which in real terms could mean an entire strip of land left fallow this year for want of seed. You catch it only because something in the total feels wrong to you. A faint unease you cannot immediately explain, and you make Watt read the relevant sticks back to you twice more before the error surfaces and you correct it, your heart hammering unpleasantly hard for someone who's done nothing more strenuous than sit and think. "You're certain now?" Watt asks, his voice small. "I'm certain," you say, though the honest truth is that certainty at your age, with your memory, is a thing you have learned to hold more lightly than you once did. You have seen your own mind slip before. Small things, a name forgotten mid-sentence, a face you should know gone suddenly, embarrassingly blank. It has not happened with the tally marks, not yet. But you are aware, in a way you were not aware even 5 years ago, that the day might come when it does, and that day will be the day you finally stop being useful, in the only way this village still needs you to be. The steward arrives close to midday exactly as promised, riding into the village on a horse far better fed than any beast the village itself owns, trailed by 2 servants, and an air of a man who has done this exact task in a dozen other villages this same week, and has grown thoroughly bored of all of them. He is younger than you expected, sharp-faced, with the particular impatience of a man who resents being sent to count grain in a half-empty village when he'd rather be somewhere warmer. Osbert presents the tally with a confidence he has not earned, standing a little too straight, and you watch from the church doorway, hands folded into your shawl to hide their trembling, as the steward runs his eye down what's careful, childish letters. 11 quarters wheat, the steward reads aloud, more to himself than to anyone. 14 barley, 6 oats, seed grain set aside separate, I see, sensible, 3 peas, 2 salted meat. He looks up, and his gaze sweeps the assembled village. Osbert, what? You standing slightly apart, a scattering of others who have gathered to watch with the particular tense stillness of people whose winter is being decided in front of them. This matches close enough to what I'd expect from a holding this size, even reduced as you are. Better organised than the last 3 villages I've visited, in fact. Who kept this reckoning? There is a small silence. Osbert's jaw works. You can see him weighing whether to claim the credit himself, and you can also see, with the particular clarity that comes from having known men like Osbert your entire long life, that he decides against it. Not out of honesty, particularly, but out of the practical calculation that if the steward asks a follow-up question about the old bailiff's marking system, and Osbert cannot answer it, the lie will unravel worse than the truth would have. The widow Agnes, Osbert says, gesturing toward you without quite looking at you. She kept accounts for the old bailiff before the sickness, before most of you were born, he adds to his own men, a small, graceless attempt to reclaim some authority in the moment of surrendering it. The steward's eyes find you, and you feel the old, familiar sensation of being assessed and found unremarkable. An old woman in a worn shawl, stooped slightly, hands visibly trembling in the cold. You watch him decide in the space of a glance that you're not worth further attention, and you feel the strange double weight of relief and insult that comes with being underestimated by someone whose good opinion you do not actually need, but whose bad opinion could still theoretically cost the village dearly. Well, the steward says, already turning back to his ledger, whoever kept it, it's kept well. Tell your reeve here he can thank you by not starving before Michaelmas. A joke, offered without warmth, the kind wealthy men make about the hardship of the poor as though hardship were an amusing eccentricity rather than a daily terror. Nobody laughs. He does not appear to notice or care. He stays another hour, checking stores against tally with his own men, finding nothing to dispute, and then he is gone, riding out of the village the same way he arrived, leaving behind him the simple, enormous fact that the winter reckoning has come out clean, the Lord's rents will be paid without excess seizure, and the village keeps enough grain to see itself through to spring, barely, precariously, but enough. Osbert does not thank you directly. He never quite manages that. But as the steward's party disappears down the frozen lane, he turns to you and says gruffly, "You'll take a share of the meat stores tonight, for your hut, for the boy's fever." It is not gratitude exactly. It is closer to payment, the acknowledgement of a debt discharged rather than a kindness offered. But you understand from long experience that in this village, in this year, that is often as close to thanks as anyone gets, and you take it without complaint, because a share of meat for a sick child is worth more to you than 100 warm words would be. You have barely turned to leave the churchyard when one of the steward's men, not the steward himself, gone ahead already, but the younger of his 2 servants, a man with a clerk's soft hands and a bailiff's hard eyes, calls you back with a small official cough that you've learned, over decades, to recognise as the sound a manor makes just before it asks something of you that you would rather not give. The customary, he says, consulting a smaller separate ledger he has kept tucked inside his coat, shows the tenement your son held owing 3 days' boon work at the spring ploughing, unless commuted by payment. Your son being dead these 2 years and no adult male remaining in that household to render the service, the obligation falls by custom to whoever holds the tenancy in his place. You feel the old familiar weight of manorial custom settle onto your shoulders, a weight that does not care how old your shoulders have become, that has never once in 400 years of being written down and enforced made allowance for a body too stiff and too slow to do the ploughing itself. There is no adult male in that household, you say, keeping your voice level with an effort. There is myself past 60 years and my son's widow, who works the strips as best she can already, and 2 children too young to plough a furrow straight. What labour do you imagine any of us can render at the spring ploughing that the Lord's own reeve would accept? The clerk's hard eyes flick over you with the particular practised indifference of a man who has heard 100 versions of this exact protest from 100 exhausted households this same season, and finds none of them, however true, sufficient reason to alter what the ledger says. Custom is custom, he says. The obligation may be commuted to a payment in coin or in kind, if the household cannot render the labour itself. 2 days' wage in silver, or its equivalent in grain paid before Lady Day. 2 days' wage in grain is not a small thing to a household already portion thin by the village's own hard reckoning not an hour past. You feel a flare of the old anger rise in your chest. Not at this particular clerk who is simply doing the unglamorous work he has been sent to do, but at the whole enormous, unmoving machinery of custom itself, the ancient written expectation that a tenement owes its labour regardless of whether any body remains within it capable of performing that labour, regardless of plague, regardless of death, regardless of the plain physical fact that you cannot swing a plough the way your son once could, and no amount of manorial ink will change that fact by wishing it away. I kept the bailiff's accounts once, you say, before you can stop yourself, some old stubborn pride rising up through the exhaustion. Before either of us was born, most likely. I know the custumal as well as any clerk who's read it fresh off a page this winter. There is a provision. I have seen it invoked in this very manner in the old bailiff's time, for households reduced by plague or war to render lesser service at the reeve's discretion, so long as some portion of the obligation is met in whatever form the household can manage. Ask your steward. He will know the clause, even if you do not. The clerk's expression shifts, just slightly. Not quite respect, but a flicker of recalculation, the recognition that the old woman in front of him is not simply another ignorant tenant to be quoted a figure and sent away frightened. I'll bring it to him, he says, more grudgingly now, and makes a small note in his ledger before moving off toward his waiting horse. You do not know, standing there in the cold churchyard with your legs trembling from the effort of having argued twice now in one morning, whether the appeal will succeed, or whether Lady Day will still arrive with a demand for grain or silver your household cannot easily spare. You know only that you have done once again the single thing your failing body can still reliably offer this family. Not labour, which you no longer have to give, but memory, the specific, hard-won knowledge of exactly which old clauses and old customs might yet be turned to a struggling household's advantage. Knowledge that took you decades of unglamorous, tedious study to acquire, and that not one other living soul in this village currently possesses in the same depth. It occurs to you, walking away, that this is perhaps the truest shape of what growing old inside a place like this actually means. The manor doesn't care how old you are. The customary was written by men long dead for tenants long dead, and it has never once paused to ask whether the current holder of an obligation still has the strength to meet it in the manner originally intended. The demands do not soften simply because the body meant to answer them has grown frail. What softens, if anything softens at all, is only ever the small human margin around the edges of those demands. A reeve's willingness to accept a lesser service, a clerk's grudging agreement to raise a question with his steward, a village's collective decision, argued out in a cold churchyard to portion its scant grain by need rather than solely by labour. The world's larger machinery keeps turning at the same pace regardless of your age. Survival, at your age, depends entirely on whether enough people around that machinery are willing to bend its smaller gears slightly, quietly, in your favour. But the reckoning is not finished simply because the steward has ridden away satisfied. Grain counted is not grain distributed, and the moment the manor's business concludes, the village's own business begins, uglier and more personal than anything a stranger on a fine horse would ever be asked to referee. Osbert calls the heads of households together in the churchyard before the midday meal, standing in the thin winter light with his breath fogging and his arms crossed, and you are asked to stay, not as a head of household yourself, since technically that honour belongs to Mabel now, widowed as she is, but as the keeper of the tally, the one person present who can say with authority exactly how much grain the village actually has and exactly how thin that margin runs. The argument that follows is one you have heard some version of every hard winter of your life, though it has grown sharper and more desperate since the sickness thinned the village down to its current fragile size. A younger man named Thomas, broad-shouldered and impatient, argues that the grain should be portioned by the work a household can still perform, full shares to households with able hands to plow and thresh come spring, reduced shares to households too old or too sick or too encumbered with small children to contribute equal labour. It is not a cruel argument, not exactly. It has the cold, practical shape of a man trying to keep a starving village from starving worse, trying to ensure that the hands doing the heaviest work do not collapse from hunger before the spring planting is finished. But you know exactly whose households sit on the losing end of that particular arithmetic, because you have spent the whole morning inside one of them. And what of the widow Cecilia, you say, your voice steadier than you feel, whose wrist I set not 3 hours past, who worked this village's fields for 50 years before her body gave out, and who cannot lift a sack of grain herself now, but has a daughter who can, and would, if her mother is fed enough to survive until spring. You look around at the gathered faces, weathered and thin and worried, and you press on before your courage or your breath fails you. And what of my own grandson, 4 years old, fevered since yesterday, who contributes no labour at all and will contribute none for a decade yet, but whose survival is the only reason his mother has any reason left to work herself half to death in your fields come spring? Do we starve the old and the young first and hope the middle holds the village together alone? Because I promise you, it will not. It never has. A village is not only its strongest arms, it is also whoever remembers how to use them wisely, and whoever will carry the next generation forward once this one is spent. There is a silence after you finish, the particular silence of people who do not entirely disagree with you, but also do not particularly want to hear it, because agreeing means less grain in their own children's bowls, and disagreeing means saying aloud, in front of the church, that some lives in this village matter less than others when the winter turns hard. It is the priest, Father Roger, thin and stooped, and himself older than most of the men arguing, who finally breaks the silence. "The widow reckons true," he says. "We're commanded to care for the old and the fatherless, and I'll remind any man who forgets it that our Lord has already thinned this parish once, in living memory, and did not consult any of us on the manner of his accounting. Portion the grain by need, not solely by labour, and trust that the labour will find its own way to be grateful come spring. It is not a decisive victory. Thomas and 2 others still grumble, still argue for a smaller share to the households that cannot plough, and the final portioning that emerges from the argument is a compromise nobody is fully satisfied with. Reduce shares for the households with no able adult, but not so reduced that anyone in them will actually starve before the thaw, provided the winter runs no harder than usual, and no new sickness comes to complicate the accounting further. You walk away from the churchyard with your own share and Cecilia's and 2 others, secured at a level that will keep their occupants fed, and you feel, underneath the bone-deep exhaustion of having argued in a cold churchyard for an hour on top of everything else the day has already asked of you, a small, fierce satisfaction that has nothing to do with your aching hip, and everything to do with the plain fact that your voice, old and cracked as it has become, still carries enough weight in this village to bend an unfair argument back toward fairness. You think, walking home, of the girl you were 60 years ago, sitting at the old bailiff's elbow in a room not unlike the church you've just left, learning to read notched sticks and scratched parchment, while he grumbled about the laziness of the tenants and the greed of the Lord Steward in equal measure. He was a hard man, that bailiff, quick with a cuff to the ear if you misread a mark, but he taught you something in those 6 years that you did not fully understand until decades later, that numbers, properly kept, were a kind of shield. A household with an honest, careful reckoning behind it could not be cheated as easily as one that kept no records at all, could not be told it owed more than it truly owed, could not be starved by a steward's convenient miscounting. You did not know. Learning your letters and your notches as a girl of 12 with ink-stained fingers, not unlike Watts this morning, that you were learning the exact skill that would one day stand between your own grandson and a hungry spring. Nobody ever tells you, when you're young and being taught something tedious and difficult, which of the tedious, difficult things will turn out decades later to be the one thing that saves someone you love. There is a small market of sorts still held in the village on the days the weather allows it. Not a proper market, nothing like the fairs of better years, just a handful of women setting out what little they have to trade along the low wall near the well. You stop there on your way home, because your feverfew is nearly spent and there is a woman 2 houses down, Joan, who keeps bees in warmer months and trades honey through the winter for whatever small thing she needs, and honey, mixed into a fever tonic, does more good for a sick child's throat than plain water ever could. Joan is another of the village's remaining old women, her hands gnarled worse than your own from decades of hive work, her face a map of the same weather and hardship that has carved its lines into yours. You have known each other since before either of you were married, and there is a particular ease between you now that only comes from having watched the same 60 years pass from adjacent vantage points, having buried husbands and children in the same short span of terrible seasons, having grown old together, whether either of you particularly chose it. "How's the boy?" Joan asks, not looking up from the small crock of honey she's sealing with wax. "Fever's up since this morning. I've little fever-few left." Joan's hand still. She sets the crock down and reaches instead for a smaller pot. Tucked behind the others, the good honey she keeps back for exactly these moments. "Take it," she says, pushing it toward you. No trade needed. Not for the boy. You start to protest. Trade is trade, and Joan has as little to spare as anyone this winter. But she waves you off with the particular impatience of an old woman who has decided a thing and does not intend to be argued out of it. We're neither of us going to eat our way through a village's worth of grief by being proud with each other, Joan says. Save your pride for the young ones. We're past the age where it does either of us any good. She pats your hand once, her fingers as swollen and slow as your own, and there is something in the small contact, skin against skin. Both of you marked the same way by the same long years, that steadies something in your chest that the whole morning's crises had left shaking. You're still standing near the low wall with Joan's honey tucked against your side when Isabel comes past again, an empty bucket swinging from one hand, on her way back to the well for a second load, now that the morning's water has been used up faster than expected, with a sick child in the house, needing so much of it warmed and cooled and warmed again. She slows when she sees you. Some of the earlier morning's brisk indifference softened now by simple curiosity, or perhaps by the plain fact that a girl her age, done with her errand for the moment, is glad of any excuse to stand still and talk rather than hurry on to the next task. Is the honey for the boy? She asks, nodding at the small crock in your hand. For his throat, mixed with what herb I've left. Fever's high today. Isabel's face does something complicated, worry mostly, but also a flicker of the specific helplessness of the young. In the face of illness they do not yet know how to fight, and you recognize it, because you remember owning that same helplessness once yourself, decades before you'd learned enough to feel less afraid of a fevered child than you feel today, though today's fear, you privately admit, has never fully gone away no matter how much you've learned. My mother says you know more herbs than anyone left in the village now that old Margaret's gone, Isabel says. She says you saved her sister's baby 2 winters back when everyone thought the cough would take him. You did save that baby, though you remember it now more as a long, exhausting night of steaming pots and warm cloths than as any single dramatic act of skill. And you tell Isabel as much, because you have never had much patience for being spoken of as though your knowledge was some kind of magic rather than the plain, accumulated result of decades spent paying close attention to which remedies worked, and which merely felt like they should. Would you show me? Isabel asks, and there is something almost shy in the asking, as though she expects to be waved off, told she's too young or too busy with water hauling to spend her hours learning herbcraft from an old woman with failing hands. Not today. I know today you're busy with the boy, but sometime before. She stops, the way what stopped earlier, unwilling to finish a sentence that ends, however gently phrased, in your eventual absence from this village. You feel, for the second time this same long day, the strange mixture of sorrow and gladness that comes from being asked plainly by the young to pass on what you know before you are no longer able to pass it on at all. It is not a comfortable feeling, being reminded so directly and so often in the course of one ordinary day that your remaining time for teaching is understood by everyone around you to be finite, perhaps nearer its end than its middle. But there is a comfort folded inside the discomfort too, the comfort of knowing that what you carry will not simply vanish into the ground alongside you, that some of it at least, the tally marks with what, the herbcraft with Isabel, whatever else these next months allow you strength enough to teach, will keep walking around this valley in younger bodies long after your own has been laid to rest beside your husband's. Come by after the frost breaks properly, you tell her. I'll show you what grows along the hedgerow that's worth gathering, and what only looks worth gathering and will do you no good at all. There's difference, and it matters more than you'd think. You pause, and then add, because it feels true and worth saying plainly. You've a good memory, Isabel, if you'll use it. I watched you learn the well rota faster than any girl your age I've known. Herbcraft's no different. It only wants attention and patience, the same as any other skill worth having. She thanks you, ducking her head in the particular quick, pleased way of the young when praised by someone whose opinion has begun, unexpectedly, to matter to them. And then she's off toward the well again, her bucket swinging, her strong young back already bent to the day's next task, and you watch her go with something that feels, against all the day's aches and fears, almost like hope. You walk the rest of the way home with the honey warm against your side, thinking that this too is a part of growing old that the young do not see and cannot yet understand. Not only the failing of the body, but the particular, hard-won solidarity of those who have failed alongside each other, who no longer need to explain their aches to one another because the aches are shared, who've learned that pride is a luxury the old can rarely afford, and that the alternative, plain, unadorned mutual help, given and received without ceremony, is its own kind of grace. The afternoon does not grant you rest. There is no version of your life left in which a morning's crisis earns an afternoon's ease. You walk home slowly, your hips screaming with every uneven step, your back locked into the particular ache that hours on cold stone have carved into it, and you find, waiting at your door, a woman you half recognize from 2 houses down, twisting her hands together with the specific anxiety of someone about to ask a favour she isn't sure she has any right to ask. "It's my mother," the woman says before you've even fully stopped walking. "She's took a fall. Her arm's wrong. Bent wrong at the wrist. She's in terrible pain and I don't know what to do for her." You go, of course. There was never a version of this afternoon in which you did not go. Your body registers a fresh wave of protest at the prospect of more standing, more kneeling, more of the small physical cost that every act of help now demands from you, and you push the protest down the way you have learned, over years of practice to push it down, because the alternative, refusing, resting, tending only to yourself, has never once in 60 years felt like a real option available to you. The old woman, older than you in fact by a decade at least, a woman named Cecilia whom you have known since girlhood, lies on a pallet with her face grey and her right wrist bent at an angle no healthy joint should manage, the skin already swelling and darkening around the break. She is not screaming. She has moved past screaming into a low, continuous moan that is somehow worse, the sound of a body that has simply run out of the energy required to protest properly and has settled instead into raw endurance. You kneel beside her, the knees again, the sharp jab, the held breath, and you take her uninjured hand in both of yours, and you look at the break, and you feel the old dread rise in your chest, because a broken wrist at Cecilia's age, in this village, in this winter, is not a small thing. Bones do not knit the way they used to when you are this old. A break like this can mean the arm never fully works again, which means one more pair of hands lost to the work of survival, which means one more mouth that must be fed by hands that are not its own. I need cold water, clean cloth, and 2 flat pieces of wood, you tell the daughter, your voice steadier than your own hands feel. And someone strong enough to hold her still while I set it, because it has to be set, and it has to be set now, before the swelling gets worse and makes it impossible. The daughter's face goes white. "You'll set it? Yourself? I've set worse," you say. which is true, though you do not add that you have not attempted such a thing in years, and that your own hands are no longer the steady, strong hands of the woman who once set bones for half the parish. You do not add that the very fingers you will need to use for this task are themselves stiff and curled and slow to obey you. There is no room in this moment for that particular honesty. Cecilia needs a healer, and you are the only one within reach who has ever learned the trade, and so you will be that healer, whatever the cost to your own aching hands. Before any of that, there is the examining, and the examining alone costs you more than you'd like to admit. You take Cecilia's swollen wrist between both your hands, feeling for the specific wrongness beneath the skin. Not merely the swelling, which anyone could see, but the deeper, subtler misalignment underneath it, the place where bone has slid past bone and settled somewhere it was never meant to rest. Your fingers, thickened and slow as they've become, have to work harder now to read what they once read instantly, pressing gently along the length of the forearm, feeling for the small, telltale grate of broken edges shifting against each other, beneath skin gone tight and hot with swelling. Cecilia flinches and cries out at even this careful pressure, and you murmur the same low, steady words you have murmured to frightened, hurting people for 40 years. Not promises, because you have learned never to promise an outcome you cannot guarantee, but simple, steadying sounds, the verbal equivalent of a hand held firm on a trembling shoulder. The bone itself, once you find it properly, has the particular give of green wood under strain. Not broken clean through in one place, you judge, but bent and cracked along its length. The kind of break that can be coaxed back toward true if the coaxing is done firmly and quickly, and that will only worsen. Twist further from true if the coaxing is done timidly or too slowly. You have set enough bones across enough decades to trust this particular judgment even now. Even with your own hands weaker than the hands that first learned the trade, and you brace yourself. One hand cupped firm around Cecilia's palm, just below the break, the other braced above her elbow to hold the upper arm still against the pull you're about to apply, and you feel the full familiar weight of what is about to happen settle into your own tired shoulders. The setting itself is brutal. For Cecilia, whose scream when the bone finally slides back into rough alignment tears through the small hut, and sends the daughter's own children fleeing outside in terror, and for you, whose fingers cramp and shake with the strain of gripping and pulling and guiding a broken bone back toward true. Using strength you're no longer certain you actually have. Sweat breaks out along your hairline despite the cold. Your bad hip screams a continuous protest at the awkward braced position you have to hold to get enough leverage. When it is done, when the bone sits as close to straight as your aging skill can manage, splinted between the two flat boards and bound tight with the clean cloth, you sit back on your heels and find that your whole body is trembling, not entirely from the cold. It's set, you tell the daughter, who is crying with relief and horror in roughly equal measure. It may never be perfectly straight again, but it should knit. Keep it bound, keep her warm, feed her broth, not solid food for the first few days. Her body needs its strength for healing, not for digesting. You do not tell her that you are less certain of this outcome than your voice suggests. You do not tell her that 40 years ago you would have known, with real confidence, exactly how a break like this would heal, and that now, with your own memory dimmed in places and your own hands unreliable, you're working half from remembered knowledge and half from simple hope. This too is a part of growing old that nobody warns you about. Not merely that your body weakens, but that your certainty weakens with it. that the confidence which once came from decades of accumulated skill starts to fray at the edges, leaving you to perform competence you're no longer entirely sure you still possess. Father Roger comes to the door as you're finishing the splinting, drawn by word that had already travelled the short distance between houses, the way word always does in a village this small, and he stands in the doorway a moment taking in the scene, Cecilia pale and trembling on her pallet, her daughter still crying, you kneeling on the floor with your hands stained and your knees screaming their long protest at the position you've held them in. "Is it the sickness?" he asks, and though his voice is careful and calm, you hear underneath it the same thin thread of fear that runs through every question anyone in this village asks now about any illness, any injury, any unexplained pain. 4 years is not long enough for that fear to have worn away. You doubt honestly that a lifetime would be long enough. A fall, you say without turning. A broken wrist, nothing more. No fever in her, no marks on her skin. You know exactly what he is checking for. The black swellings that gave the sickness its name in some parts, or the fever that came first and the swellings after, and you understand his fear well enough not to resent the question, because you carry the same fear yourself, checking every unexplained ache in your own body these past 4 years with a private, unspoken dread that has never fully gone quiet. Every winter cough makes you wonder. Every unexplained fatigue makes you wonder. You have learned to live alongside that wonder in the way you have learned to live alongside your aching hip, a permanent tenant in a body that no longer entirely belongs to you. Father Roger crosses himself anyway, a small automatic gesture, and mutters something under his breath that might be a prayer of thanks, or might simply be the reflexive comfort of ritual in the face of continued uncertainty. "I'll pray for her healing," he says, and means it. And there is something in the plainness of the offer. No theatrics, no performance, just a tired old priest offering the one thing that is still fully within his power to give, that you find unexpectedly moving, standing there with your hands still shaking from the effort of setting a bone. He lingers a moment longer, watching you finish binding the splint, and then he says, quieter, meant only for you, "You did good work today, Agnes. The tally this morning, this now. There are not many of us left who remember how things were done before, who can still do the doing of it as well as the remembering." He pauses, and something crosses his lined face that looks almost like grief. "I buried more of this parish in 6 weeks. 4 years past than I'd buried in the 20 years before it combined. I still see their faces sometimes when I close my eyes at night. I still say their names by accident, calling for people who are 2 years dead, and catch myself, and feel the loss all over again as if it were fresh." He shakes his head slowly. "It does me good to see one of you still standing, still useful, still stubborn enough to keep going. God keeps some of us around for a reason, even if he rarely troubles himself to explain what the reason is. You do not have an answer for that. You have wondered the same thing yourself, more nights than you would ever admit aloud, lying awake with your aching joints and your too clear memory of everyone the sickness took instead of you. There is no comfortable answer. There is only the plain fact of continuing day after day, doing whatever useful thing presents itself and trusting, or perhaps simply hoping, which is a smaller and more honest word for the same feeling, that the continuing itself amounts to something, even without a reason attached to explain it. Father Roger takes his leave, off to see to some other small crisis in a village that seems, these past 4 years, to generate crises the way a wound generates pus, slowly, continuously, in a way that never quite stops no matter how carefully the wound is tended. You finish with Cecilia, give the daughter clear instructions on the care of the splint and the signs that would mean real trouble, fever, blackening skin, a smell that should not be there. And you make your slow way back out into the cold afternoon, your whole body one long continuous complaint by now, hip and knees and back and hands all competing for which ache deserves your attention first. You think, walking, of your own mother, dead these 30 years now, of nothing more dramatic than old age itself, worn down slowly over decades, until one winter she simply did not have the strength left to fight off a chest cough that a younger body would have shaken in a week. You remember sitting with her in her final days, much the way you sat with the boy last night, watching a body you loved fail by degrees, unable to do anything more than make the failing as gentle as your hands could manage. You did not understand then, watching your own mother's slow decline, how closely you would one day come to walk the same road yourself, the same stiffening joints, the same slowing hands, the same accumulating catalogue of small failures that the body reports to you daily now as though delivering news you never asked to receive. You understand it now. You have understood it piece by piece, for a decade at least, ever since your hands first began to betray you at tasks they used to manage without thought. Ever since your knees first began charging a toll for the simple privilege of standing. There is no bitterness in the understanding, not exactly, though there was bitterness once in the earlier years of this long decline, when every new failing felt like a fresh injustice, a theft of something that should rightfully still be yours. The bitterness has worn away slowly, the way most things wear away, with enough time and enough repetition, replaced by something closer to a weary, clear-eyed acceptance. Not resignation exactly, because you have not stopped fighting the failing, have not stopped forcing your reluctant body through whatever work the day demands of it, but an acceptance of the shape the fight now takes, the knowledge that every task will cost more than it once did and must be attempted anyway, because the alternative, surrender, idleness, the slow curling inward of a life that has decided it is finished before it is actually finished, has never once in 60 years looked like a life you wanted to live. By the time you leave Cecilia's hut, the light is already failing, the sky gone the colour of old pewter, the cold deepening in the particular way it does just before true dark. Your whole body aches in ways that are becoming difficult to separate from each other. Hip, knees, back, hands, shoulders, all of it blurred into one continuous low-grade misery that you have simply learned to carry the way you carry everything else, because there is no alternative, no one to hand the pain to, no version of your life in which rest is offered rather than seized in whatever scraps the day allows. You walk home through a village that has gone quiet with evening, smoke rising thin and grey from the low roofs, the sound of someone's cow lowing in a byre, a dog barking somewhere down the lane at nothing in particular. You pass the graveyard again, and this time, exhausted enough that your guard has slipped, you let your eyes rest on it, on the humps of earth that mark where your husband lies, where 2 of your children lie, where the sickness put more bodies in the ground in 6 weeks. 4 years ago than the whole parish usually loses in 6 years combined. You stop for just a moment, your breath fogging in the cold air, and you let yourself feel the full weight of it, How strange it is to have outlived so many. How strange it is to be the one still standing when so many stronger, younger bodies are the ones lying under that frozen ground. You remember the shape of those 6 weeks, the way you remember almost nothing else from the whole span of your long life. Not in the soft, worn way of an old memory handled so often it has gone smooth at the edges, but sharp, whole, preserved exactly as it happened, the way a burn preserves the shape of whatever touched it. Your husband had been a strong man, broad through the shoulders, hands roughened from 40 years of working the same strips of land his own father had worked before him. A man who had never in your memory of him spent a full day abed with sickness. The fever took him in 4 days. You remember the particular smell of it. Not merely sweat and sickness, but something else underneath. A sourness that seemed to rise up out of him from somewhere deeper than skin, and the swellings that came on the second day, dark and hard beneath his arms and at his throat. Swellings you pressed cool cloths against with hands that were then still steady and strong, though nothing you did eased them even slightly. You remember the sound he made in the final hours. Not screaming. He was never a man given to screaming, but a low continuous moan, not unlike the one Cecilia made this very morning under the pain of her broken wrist. Except that this moan had no cause you could reach with your hands, no bone to set, no simple mechanical wrongness you could correct through pressure and patience and the accumulated knowledge of 60 years. You remember sitting beside him through that last night. The same way you sat with the boy last night, except that this vigil ended differently, ended with a stillness in the small hours that you felt before you fully understood it, a change in the rhythm of the room that told you before your mind caught up with your body's knowledge that you were now alone in a way you had not been alone since before your marriage. You buried him 3 days later, once the priest's own household could spare the strength to dig one more grave among the dozens they were already digging that same terrible fortnight. And you remember standing at the edge of that grave with 2 of your children already dead beside him in the ground and a third one coughing. Even then, in a way that told you the sickness was not yet finished with your family. And you remember thinking, with a clarity that shames you even now, that you did not know how you were meant to keep breathing through a grief this large. That grief of this particular size seemed like something a human body should not be able to survive, and yet your body did survive it. Breath following breath, with no consultation from the part of you that wanted quite badly, for it all simply to stop. It did not stop. You are proof, standing here in this same cold churchyard 4 years later, with your hip aching and your hands curled, and your grandson's fever finally cooling somewhere behind you in a warm hut, that a body can go on breathing long after the mind attached to it has concluded there is no good reason left to bother. You have never fully understood why yours was one of the bodies that kept going. You suspect some nights that there is no reason at all, that survival after a loss that size is simply a mechanical fact of lungs and heart continuing their old habits without requesting the soul's permission, and that whatever meaning eventually gets built on top of that bare mechanical continuing is something the survivor constructs afterward, slowly, out of necessity. Because a life that continues without any meaning attached to it is a harder thing to carry than a life with even a small invented purpose stitched across the wound. Your purpose these past 4 years has been exactly the shape of today. Tally sticks and broken bones and fevered children, the small, unglamorous work of keeping a diminished household and a diminished village breathing one more season at a time. It is not the purpose you would have chosen, at 20, imagining the shape your old age might take. It is nonetheless the purpose you have, and on nights like tonight, standing in a graveyard full of people you loved, with a grandson's fever finally breaking somewhere behind you, it feels, if not like enough, then at least like something. A small, stubborn continuation of a life that had every reasonable excuse to stop and did not take it. You do not know why you were spared and they were not. You've stopped years ago expecting that question to have an answer. This sickness did not choose the weak over the strong, or the old over the young, or the good over the wicked. It simply came, and it took what it took, and it left behind whoever it left behind, and you happened to be one of the ones it left, and the only thing you can do with that fact is use whatever time remains to you as usefully as your failing body will allow. The well in the centre of the village has run low these past weeks, fouled besides by something dead that fell in, and was fished back out too late to save the water above it, and so the household water for the past fortnight has come instead from the stream that cuts along the low edge of the village, past the mill that no longer turns because the miller died in the sickness, and no one has yet found the coin or the courage to replace him. It is Mabel's errand. Ordinarily, she's younger, steadier on her feet, able to carry 2 full buckets on a yoke across her shoulders the way you no longer can. But Mabel has not left the boy's side since midday, and the household's water has run down to a single cup by the time you pass the hut on your way back from Cecilia's, and someone must go, and there is, again, no one else free to go. You take the smaller of the 2 buckets, empty, and the old yoke that has hung on its peg by the door since your own husband's time, and you walk the short distance to the stream in light that has already begun its slide toward dusk. The sky gone the flat grey violet of late afternoon in deep winter, the cold sharpening with every degree the sun sinks. The path down to the water is one you've walked 1,000 times across 60 years, and yet tonight it feels unfamiliar in the particular way a well-known path always feels unfamiliar when your body can no longer trust itself on it. The slope steeper than you remember, the footing rougher, every root and stone along the bank suddenly a hazard where once they were simply the ground. The stream itself has begun to skin over at its edges, a thin, treacherous rime of ice creeping inward from both banks toward the still flowing water at the centre, black and cold and moving with a low, steady murmur that sounds, in the failing light, almost like a voice muttering something just below the range of understanding. You crouch at the bank, carefully, one hand braced on a half-buried stone, your knees announcing their objection the moment you lower your weight onto them, and you reach the bucket out toward the open water, past the skin of ice at the edge, because water drawn too near the frozen margin comes up thick with slush that will only refreeze in the bucket before you're halfway home. The stone under your bracing hand shifts. It is a small thing, a half-inch settling of loose earth beneath old, frost-heaved ground. But it is enough. Your weight, already balanced badly on knees that no longer hold a crouch the way they once did, lurches forward, and for one long suspended instant you're looking directly down into black moving water that would swallow you to the chest if you went in. Water cold enough in this season to stop a heart far younger than yours within minutes. Water that has, in living memory, taken exactly that toll from at least 2 people in this parish who slipped at this same bank in weather no worse than tonight's. Your free hand shoots out and catches a root, exposed and gnarled, running along the bank where the earth has eroded away from it over years of exactly this kind of use, and it holds Thank every saint you can name in the frantic half-second it takes to think of them. It holds your weight long enough for you to drag yourself backward, away from the black water, your knees scraping hard against half-frozen ground, your heart slamming so violently against your ribs that for a moment you can hear nothing else at all. Not the stream, not the wind, not your own ragged breathing, only the enormous thudding fact of your own pulse, insisting that you are for now still alive. You kneel there on the bank for a long moment, the empty bucket lying on its side a foot from your hand, your whole body shaking with something that is not entirely the cold, and you allow yourself in the gathering dark with no one present to see it, a single sharp, frightened sound that is not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. The particular sound a body makes when it has looked directly at its own ending and been given back. This one time, an unearned reprieve. This is the danger that no tally stick or fever tincture can prepare you for. Not the slow, grinding failure of joints and hands that you've learned, over years, to work around and endure, but the sudden, single instant where age and ice and a half-inch of shifting earth conspire to end everything at once, with no warning and no ceremony, the kind of death that would leave Mabel and the children with no water, and no old woman either, and no one in the village to know exactly what had happened until someone eventually came looking and found only an overturned bucket on an empty bank. You do not draw the water from that spot. You move along the bank, slower now, testing every handhold and foothold with a caution that costs you precious dwindling light, until you find a place where a flat, stable rock gives you honest purchase, and there, at last, you fill the bucket properly, your hands raw and aching from the cold water that splashes over them in the process, your knees soaked through where you knelt on half-frozen mud. The walk back up the slope with a full bucket is its own separate trial, the yoke biting into shoulders that have grown thin and bony with age, the weight of the water pulling at muscles that ache in new configurations with every uneven step, your breath coming in short, effortful clouds in the deepening cold. You do not think on the walk back about how close the stream came to taking you. You have learned, over 60 years, that dwelling on a danger already survived does nothing useful except steal strength from the danger still ahead of you tonight. And there is, you already suspect, without yet knowing the particulars, at least one more danger waiting for you back at the hut. Your daughter-in-law Mabel meets you at the door with real fear in her face, and your stomach drops before she even speaks, thinking instantly of the boy and his fever. "He's worse," she says. "Since midday, the fever's climbed." You go to him immediately, setting aside every ache in your own body the way you've learned to do, and you find him restless on the pallet, his small face flushed, his breath coming faster and shallower than it should. A fine sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cold of the hut. You press your crooked fingers to his skin and feel heat that worries you seriously now, heat that has moved past the simple, warning warmth of this morning into something that demands real intervention. "The feverfew," you say, "now, and I'll need vinegar and clean cloth for cooling him." You measure the precious remaining herb with hands that shake, not from age this time, or not only from age, but from the particular fear that comes with a sick child and dwindling medicine, and no way to get more until spring finally properly arrives. You steep it in water that is not quite hot enough because there is not quite enough fuel left in the fire to make it properly hot, and you coax the bitter liquid past the boy's cracked lips a spoonful at a time, and you soak cloths in vinegar water and lay them across his forehead and the insides of his wrists, and you do every single thing your 60-some years of accumulated knowledge tells you to do. and then you sit beside him through the evening with absolutely no certainty that any of it will be enough. This is the part of aging that no one prepares you for either. Not the failing body, which at least announces itself honestly, joint by joint, but the particular, specific dread of realizing that your usefulness has limits, that your knowledge, vast as it feels compared to a 12-year-old clerk's boy or a village reeve too young to remember the world before plague, is not actually infinite, is not actually enough to guarantee the outcomes you most desperately want. You know how to set a bone. You know how to reckon a grain tally. You do not know, with any real certainty, whether a feverish 4-year-old boy will see morning, and there has never been, in 60 years of living, a moment where that particular kind of not knowing has become easier to sit inside. What comes to the door not long after full dark, out of breath from running, his thin shoulders heaving under a cloak too large for him. "The priest sent me," he says, "before you've even asked. Said to bring you this." He holds out a small twist of cloth, and when you unfold it, you find a pinch of dried herb you do not immediately recognize by sight, though the smell of it, sharp, bitter, faintly like the fever-few but not quite the same, tells you it is something Father Roger keeps for the specific purpose of easing a fevered child through the worst of a bad night. It is not much. It is, you understand without being told, likely all the priest had left to give, offered without hesitation the moment word reached him that the boy had worsened. "Tell him I'm grateful," you say, and Wat nods, and then lingers in the doorway a moment longer than the errand strictly requires, shifting his weight from foot to foot in the particular way of a boy who has something more to say and is working up the courage to say it. "The tally marks," he says finally. "Will you teach me the rest of them? Properly, I mean, not just today's reading. All of it." He says it in a rush, as though worried you might refuse before he finishes asking. "Osbert said Peter's son barely knows his letters, and the priest says I write well enough, but I don't know the marks the way you know them. What if the steward comes again and you're not?" He stops himself, embarrassed, unwilling to finish the sentence aloud, but you understand exactly what he was about to say and do not make him say it. What if you're not here? What if your memory has finally gone, or your hands have finally failed entirely, or you have simply died, the way so many around you have died, and there is no one left standing who remembers how the old bailiff's notches translate into a lord's ledger? You feel something settle in your chest at the question. A mixture of sadness at the plainness of a 12-year-old boy, already reckoning with mortality as a practical problem to be solved, and a fierce, unexpected gladness that he asked the question at all, that he understood, without needing to be told, exactly what was at stake in a village where knowledge this specific lives inside so few remaining heads. "Come by tomorrow after your morning duties," you tell him. "Bring the old sticks, whatever ones survive from Peter's stores. We'll start with the wheat marks, since those matter most, and work through the rest as the weeks allow." You pause and then add, because it feels important that he understand this properly. "It's not a hard thing to learn, Wat. It only feels large because so few of us are left to teach it. Learn it well enough, and you'll carry it forward long after I've gone into the ground beside my husband, and some other old woman 50 years from now will be glad of a clerk who actually knows his letters and his marks both." He nods, solemn in the particular way children are solemn when they've been handed a responsibility larger than their years, and then he's gone, running back off into the dark toward the priest's house. His small torch, nothing more than a bundle of rushes dipped in fat, throwing a wavering circle of light that shrinks and finally disappears around the bend in the lane. You close the door against the cold and go back to the boy, mixing a portion of the priest's herb into what remains of your own feverfew, coaxing the bitter mixture past his cracked lips a careful spoonful at a time. His skin has grown hotter since Watt's visit, not cooler, and a small cold worm of real fear begins to work its way through your chest, because you have seen fevers turn this way before, climbing steadily through the evening, seeming to plateau, and then climbing further still in the deep hours of the night when a sick body's resources are thinnest and its resistance lowest. You have lost children to fevers that climb this way. You lost one of your own daughters to exactly this pattern, decades ago now, though the grief of it has never fully dulled no matter how many years have piled on top of it, and you find yourself, without entirely meaning to, praying under your breath in the particular wordless way that comes less from formal faith than from simple, desperate hope, the kind of prayer that is really just fear given a direction to travel in. The old women of the village have their own remedies too, older than the church's remedies, older perhaps than the church itself, passed down mother to daughter to granddaughter, in a chain, the sickness 4 years past very nearly severed for good. You know them, the old remedies, learned at your own mother's knee long before you learned the tally marks at the bailiff's, a particular way of laying cool cloths not just on the forehead, but along the length of the body where the blood runs closest to the skin. A low murmured rhyme that does nothing medically, you are quite certain, but that steadies your own hands and your own breathing in a way that lets you tend the boy more calmly than raw fear alone would allow. You do not know if the rhyme helps him. You know it helps you, and on a night like this one, with nothing certain and everything at stake, you have learned not to discount even the help that only steadies the healer's own trembling hands. Outside, somewhere down the lane, a dog begins barking at something in the dark, an urgent, repeated sound that carries easily in the cold night air, and you feel your whole body tense before you can stop it. An old superstitious reflex from years when a dog's night barking sometimes meant sickness was walking the lane again, moving house to house the way it moved 4 years ago, and every unexplained sound after dark became for a season a small private terror. The barking stops after a moment, probably nothing. A fox near the hen house, or a badger crossing too close to someone's yard. You breathe out slowly and return your attention to the boy, ashamed of the old fear even as you feel it lingering in your chest, unwilling to be fully reasoned away. The night deepens around the hut. Mabel sleeps in fits beside her daughter, exhausted past the point of proper rest. You sit up with the boy because your body, cruelly, no longer needs as much sleep as it once did. One of the small, unwelcome gifts of age, a body that wakes easily and rests poorly, that seems determined to keep you conscious through every hour it possibly can, whether or not consciousness is a comfort. Mabel wakes once in the deep hours, not from any noise but from the particular restless half-sleep of a mother whose body keeps checking on her children even while her mind believes itself asleep. She sits up, sees you still upright beside the boy, your shawl pulled tight, your crooked hand resting against his forehead, and for a moment neither of you says anything, the hut quiet around you, except for the low crackle of the dying fire and the boy's uneven breathing. "You should sleep," Mabel says finally, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I can watch him." "You need the rest more than I do. My body doesn't ask for sleep the way it used to. It's one of the few mercies age has bothered to offer me." You mean it half as a joke, but Mabel doesn't laugh, only watches you with an expression you can't quite read in the dim firelight, something between gratitude and a grief that has nothing directly to do with the boy. I think about it sometimes, Mabel says, after a silence long enough that you'd thought the conversation finished. What happens to me when I'm you, if I live long enough to be you? She says it plainly, without drama, the way exhausted people sometimes say the truest things simply because they no longer have the strength left to dress a hard thought up in gentler clothing. My husband's gone. If the children don't live to grow strong, or if they do, and then leave for some better village once they're able, I don't know who sits with me the way you sit with him tonight. I don't know who fetches my water when my hands go the way yours have gone. You feel the weight of the question settle into the room, honest and unflinching in a way that few conversations in this village allow themselves to be, and you do not try to soften it with false comfort, because Mabel is not a woman who wants to be handled gently with lies, and you respect her too much to offer any. I don't know either, you say. I didn't know it at your age, and I don't fully know it now, 60 years in. Nobody promises you an answer to that question. You simply do the work in front of you. Raise the children well. Keep faith with your neighbours. Learn whatever skills the world will let you learn. And you trust that some of what you've given comes back to you, in one shape or another, when your own turn comes to need it. You pause, watching the boy's chest rise and fall in the firelight. It isn't a guarantee. I've watched good, careful women reach my age with no one left to fetch their water either. And I've watched foolish, careless ones somehow land soft, surrounded by people who love them anyway. There's no ledger for it, Mabel. No tally stick that reckons kindness given against kindness owed. You do the good you can, and you hope the world remembers to be as generous to you, eventually, as you've tried to be to it. Mabel is quiet for a long moment, and then she reaches out in the dark and rests her hand briefly over yours where it still lies against the boy's forehead, not to move it, just to touch it, the way people touch each other sometimes when words have run their course, and only contact remains to say the rest. I'm glad it's you tonight, she says simply. Whatever else, I'm glad it's you. You do not trust your voice to answer that without breaking, so you say nothing, only nod. And after a while, Mabel lies back down beside her daughter, and her breathing slows again into the rhythm of real sleep. And you sit on alone in the firelight with your hand still resting against a small, warm forehead, feeling something in your chest that is not quite grief, and not quite joy, but sits somewhere close beside both of them, the particular feeling of having been, for one more day, exactly enough. Somewhere past midnight, the boy's fever breaks. You know it before Mabel does, because you are the one sitting close enough to feel the change in his skin, the sudden drenching sweat, the small shudder that runs through his whole small body, and then, blessedly, the slow easing of his breath into something closer to normal sleep. You sit with your crooked hand still resting against his forehead, feeling the fever recede degree by careful degree, and you feel something in your own chest loosen that has been clenched tight since midday. You do not wake Mabel to tell her. There will be time for that in the morning, and she needs the sleep more than she needs the news right now. Instead, you sit alone in the dark hut, your body one long continuous ache from a day that asked far more of it than it had any right to give, and you let yourself finally feel the exhaustion all the way down to the bone. There is a fear that lives in you now, has lived in you for some years, that you have never spoken aloud to anyone, not to Mabel, not to Joan, not even to the priest in confession, though he would understand it as well as anyone in the village. It is the fear of becoming, one day, more burden than benefit, of your hands finally failing at the tally marks, the way they have already failed at hauling wood and carrying water, of your memory finally slipping past the point where anyone can trust it, of a morning arriving when Osbert or someone like him looks at you and calculates, the way men like Osbert are forced to calculate in a village this thin and this hungry, that the grain your share requires would be better spent on hands that can still plough. You have watched it happen to others, in villages not your own, in stories carried home by traders and wandering men. Old folk quietly encouraged to take less, to eat last, to understand without being told outright that their portion of the common good has begun to shrink, because the good they contribute has shrunk alongside it. You have not seen it said plainly to anyone's face. It does not need to be said plainly. A village under hard enough pressure finds its own quiet ways of communicating who matters and how much, and every person old enough to have felt their own usefulness begin to fade, learn sooner or later to read those quiet signals without needing them spelled out. It did not happen to you today. Today you were needed visibly and undeniably in 3 separate crises that no younger back could have solved in your place. But you know, with the same plain, unsentimental clarity you bring to reading a fever or a broken bone, that today is not every day, and that the day will come, perhaps not this winter, perhaps not the next, but eventually, inevitably, when your memory finally slips past useful, when your hands finally fail past mending, when there is no tally to reckon, and no bone to set and no fever to talk down, and you are simply an old woman taking up space in a hut that could otherwise hold one more working pair of hands. You do not know what that day will feel like from the inside. You suspect it will feel like today in miniature. The same fear, the same fumbling hands, the same held breath before rising from a low pallet, except that on that day there will be no reckoning at the end of it to prove your continued worth, no fevered child cooling under your palm to justify the grain you've eaten. There will only be the plain fact of your own continued existence, unearned by any labour you can still perform, and you do not know, honestly, whether the village's compassion, Father Rogers, Jones, even Osbert's grudging practical fairness, will hold steady against hunger sharp enough to test it. You push the thought down the way you push down most of your fears these days, not because pushing it down solves anything, but because there is no version of tonight in which dwelling on it changes the outcome, and a body as tired as yours needs what little peace it can find rather than a fresh wound to lie awake worrying at. Tomorrow will bring what tomorrow brings. Tonight, at least, you were needed, and being needed, even briefly, even provisionally, is worth more to you now than it ever was in the strong, thoughtless years, when you assumed your usefulness was simply a permanent feature of being alive rather than a gift that could, one day, run out. You think, in the quiet, about the shape of the day just past, about the tally sticks and the steward's careless praise, about Cecilia's wrist and the fear in her daughter's face, about this small sleeping boy whose fever you talked down through nothing but stubbornness and half-remembered herb-craft. You think about how none of it, not one piece of it, was work that required a young back or strong hands. All of it required exactly what you still have: memory, patience, the particular knowledge that only comes from having lived through enough winters to know which dangers are survivable and which patience must be spent on which crisis first. You think, too, about what Osbert said, not the words themselves, which were grudging and graceless, but the fact underneath them, the fact that the village's whole winter turned today on the accumulated knowledge sitting inside one old woman's failing body. There is a kind of dignity in that, you decide, sitting in the dark with your hand still resting on a sleeping child's cooling forehead. Not the dignity of strength, which you have lost and will never fully recover, but a different dignity, quieter and less celebrated. The dignity of being the place where a community's memory lives when everyone who might have carried it alongside you has been taken by sickness or war or simple hard luck. You think about your own grandmother again, the one you watch struggle to rise from a bench with nothing but mild impatience in your girlish heart, and you wonder, not for the first time, what accumulated knowledge she carried that you never bothered to ask her for before she died and took it with her. You resolve, the way you have resolved 100 times before and will likely resolve 100 times again, to teach Wat the tally marks properly, not just enough to read them under your instruction, but enough to keep them himself, so that when your own memory finally starts to fail, and you know, with the clear unsentimental honesty that comes from having watched it happen to others, that it eventually will, the village will not be left as helpless as it was this morning, with only one old woman standing between it and a hungry, mismanaged winter. There is a soft knock at the door not long before you finally allow yourself to think of sleep, soft enough that you almost mistake it for the wind, except the wind does not usually knock twice, evenly spaced the way a person does. You rise slower than you'd like, your body already half surrendered to the night, and find Thomas standing on the threshold, hat in hand, looking considerably less certain of himself than he looked in the churchyard that afternoon, arguing for smaller shares to weaker households. "I heard the boy's fever broke," he says, which is not, you suspect, the actual reason he has come knocking at this hour, but a reasonable enough opening for a man working his way towards something harder to say. "It has. Thank you for asking." You wait, because you have lived long enough to recognize when someone is circling a thing rather than approaching it directly, and you've learned that pressing them to hurry rarely helps. "I've been thinking on what you said this afternoon about the widow Cecilia and your grandson, and whether a village's strength lies only in its strongest arms." He turns his hat over once in his hands, an old nervous habit you remember him having even as a boy, long before he grew broad-shouldered and impatient and quick to argue for hard, practical measures in cold churchyards. "My own mother's getting on in years, slower than she was. I've caught myself thinking things about her upkeep this winter that I wouldn't say aloud to her face, and hearing myself argue today the way I argued. I didn't like the sound of it, once I'd had a few hours to sit with it." You do not rush to forgive him, not because you particularly want to hold the grudge, but because you sense that Thomas has not come here for easy absolution, that he needs, in his own graceless way, to say the rest of what's sitting in him before either of you moves toward anything like peace between you. "I'm not a cruel man," he says. "I don't think I am, anyway. I've a wife and children of my own to feed, and a hard winter ahead, and I did the arithmetic the only way I know how to do it. Strength in, strength out. I didn't think enough about what happens to a village that only values strength, and forgets that strength runs out for every single one of us eventually, my own included, if I live long enough to see it run out. You're not wrong to worry about the grain," you say, when it's clear he's finished, or at least paused long enough to want a response. A village that starves its strong arms to feed its weak ones without limit starves everyone eventually, in a different order than a village that does the reverse. There's no arithmetic that solves it cleanly, Thomas. There never has been, Not in 60 years of watching villages try. The best any of us manage is to argue it out honestly in the open in front of the church, and land somewhere that lets the old and the young survive without breaking the backs of the ones still doing the ploughing. That's what happened today. You argued your piece. I argued mine. The priest tipped the balance where it needed tipping. That's not failure on your part. That's simply how it's meant to work. Thomas looks at you for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that you recognise as a man recalculating not just his arithmetic, but some larger, less easily countable thing about how he wants to move through the rest of his life. My mother's getting on in years, he says again, as though the repetition itself is the point. I'd want someone to argue for her the way you argued for the widow Cecilia. If I couldn't manage the arguing myself one day, I'd want that for her. I suppose I ought to want it for you too, and for everyone else standing where you're standing, and not only when it's my own blood at stake. That would be a fine thing to want, you say, and mean it. And something in his broad, weathered face eases slightly, the tight, defensive set of it loosening into something closer to the boy you half remember from decades past, before hardship and responsibility carved him into the harder man he has become. He leaves shortly after, back out into the cold and the dark toward his own hut and his own worried wife and children, and you close the door behind him and stand for a moment in the quiet, thinking that this too, however small, is a piece of the day's strange accounting, not grain or coin or labour, but something less easily tallied, and perhaps, in its own way, no less valuable. One hard man's willingness to sit with an uncomfortable thought until it changed the shape of what he believed. The fire has burned down to a low bed of orange coals by the time you finally allow your own body to seek rest. You ease yourself down onto your pallet with the same careful, three-stage caution it took you to rise this morning, your joints registering each shift in position with their own particular small protests, and you lie in the dark listening to the boy's breathing, easy now, and Mabel's breathing, deep with exhausted sleep, and the small settling sounds of a hut going quiet around you. Your body aches everywhere, hip, back, knees, hands, shoulders, the specific accumulated toll of a day that demanded far more than your years want to give. But underneath the ache sits something else too, something that feels almost like satisfaction, though satisfaction has become a strange, unfamiliar word to apply to your own life these past years. You were useful today, not despite your age, but because of it, because of 60 years of accumulated memory that no young back, however strong, could have supplied in your place. You think of the centuries that will come after this one, though you have no words in your own vocabulary for centuries, no framework for imagining a world beyond the valley and the manor and the church whose bells mark your days. You only know, with the plain certainty of someone who has watched enough winters pass, that this valley will still need its old women long after you're gone. Someone to remember which field floods, someone to set a broken bone, someone to hold a fevered child through the worst hours of the night, and know from long accumulated experience exactly when to worry and when to simply wait. Someone will take up that work when you can no longer manage it. Perhaps it will be Mabel one day, worn down by her own decades the way you have been worn down by yours. Perhaps it will be someone not yet born whose name you will never know. For tonight it is enough that it was you. It is enough that your failing hands set a bone that will heal, that your slow-cutting knowledge kept a winter's grain from being seized, that you're patient, unglamorous vigilance carried a small boy through a fever that might, on a crueler night, have carried him away instead. Your eyes grow heavy. The coals dim further, their glow fading toward the deep red that means the fire will need tending again before dawn, though that tending will not be yours to do tonight. Your body has given what it has to give, and there is nothing shameful in admitting the day is finished with you before you are entirely finished with it. Let sleep come the way it always eventually comes, slow and heavy and unstoppable, easing down over the ache in your hip and the stiffness in your hands until even those old complaints go quiet. Let the boy sleep on, his fever broken, his small chest rising and falling in the easy rhythm of a child who will most likely see many more winters yet. Let the village sleep around you, fed enough, reckoned honestly, its narrow margin against hunger preserved one more season by hands too old and slow for ploughing, but not too old for memory. You are warm enough, fed enough, needed enough. You have a hearth and a grandson breathing easy beside you, and a daughter-in-law who said, in the dark, that she was glad it was you, and that is more than a great many people are given, in any century, at any age. That is enough. Tomorrow there will be more tally sticks, and more fevers, and more small breaks that need setting, and more grudging thanks paid out in shares of meat rather than in words. Tomorrow there will be a boy to teach his letters and his marks, and a girl to teach her herbs, and a hip that will ache exactly as much as it aches tonight, if not slightly more. Tomorrow the Manors costumer will still say what it has always said, indifferent to how old the hands are that must answer it. But that is tomorrow. Right now, there is only this: the dying fire, the boy's easy breathing, the particular, hard-earned quiet of a hut that made it through one more difficult day intact. The rushes on the floor need changing still, and will keep needing it whether or not your hands find the strength for the task tomorrow. The thatch above your head wants mending before the next hard rain finds its way through. None of that is tonight's concern. Tonight's concern has already been met in full by hands too slow for ploughing and a memory too stubborn to let a single one of today's crises go unanswered. Centuries will pass. The village you know will change beyond recognition. The strips of land will be enclosed and hedged and sold. The church will be rebuilt and rebuilt again. The Manors costumer will crumble into nothing but a curiosity for men who study old parchment for its own sake. And the tally marks you carry in your aching, failing memory will vanish so completely that no one, centuries from now, will even know such a system of counting once existed at all. But somewhere, in whatever shape a village takes by then, there will still be an old woman sitting up past midnight, with her hand resting on a child's forehead, testing a fever the only way a body ever learns to test one, by sitting close and waiting and refusing to look away. There will still be a girl learning a trade from failing hands before those hands go still for good. There will still be a young mother, exhausted past speech, grateful beyond words for one more person willing to carry the weight of a hard night alongside her. Some things don't change. The ache in old joints doesn't change. The fear of becoming a burden doesn't change, and neither does the quiet, stubborn refusal to become one before you absolutely must. The particular grace of being needed, even briefly, even provisionally, by people who love you, that doesn't change either. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way it took every tired old woman before you in every hut like this one, stretching back further than any tally stick could ever count. Let the fire die down to its last red coals. Let the ache in your hip go quiet, and the ache in your hands go quiet, and the fear that lives always at the edge of your thoughts go quiet too, at least for these few hours, at least until the bells ring again, and the whole long day begins its patient work of asking something more of you than your body quite wants to give. You've earned this rest. You are enough, enough, enough. Good night.